That is a very interesting first question. I was born in New York City on the 22nd of January, 1931, in Miss Lippincotts Maternity Hospital in the heart of New York City. And my mother lived until she was 90, but after I was born, they didn't think mother was going to make it. And they thought I was going to be a boy. So they had boys' names, but they didn't have any girls' names. So somebody came to my father and said, "Have you a name for this child?" And he did not. So he went out into the hall of Miss Lippincotts Maternity Hospital and asked the first nurse that he saw what her name was. And her name was Marjorie, spelled M-A-R-J-O-R-I-E, and I was then named Marjorie. I switched how I spelled it in first grade, and I spelled it M-A-R-G-E-R-Y because it was one letter shorter. And I never have cared for the name Marjorie because I'm named after a nurse who doesn't even know me and doesn't even know I'm named after her. So I nicknamed myself Marnie, and the world calls me Marnie. Well, on both sides of the family, they originated in England. And my grandfather Franks came over to this country when he was a young man with Andrew Carnegie, because somebody in his family had looked after Mr. Carnegie, who had had an illness. And so to repay Grandpa Franks's family, Mr. Carnegie said, "I would like Rob to come over to the United States." So that's how my grandfather came. And I can't tell you what year. And the Walker family came over 8 great-grandfathers ago. The Reverend William Yates, who was an Anglican minister in England, came over to this country and became the 4th president of the College of William and Mary. So on both sides, the family history goes back to England. One of my earliest childhood memories, we had lunch every Sunday at Grandpa and Granny Franks' house. They lived in Llewellyn Park as we did. And when I grew up, children did not speak unless spoken to. And they usually had guests for Sunday lunch as well. So one Sunday I was about 5, and I'm sitting on my grandfather's left, and he has a guest on his right. And I'm trying to get his attention. So I know I can't speak, so I gently pat his arm. And he turns and he looks at me and he said, "You know, I'm speaking with Mrs. Jones and you interrupted me." So he kept on talking to Mrs. Jones, and I hadn't gotten his attention. So I did it once more. So now he really stopped and he looked at me and he said, "Now you really must realize that you have interrupted me now twice. What is it that you would like to say to me?" And I said, "Grandpa, you were eating your salad and there was a worm on your tomato, but you ate it." Granny and Grandpa Franks lived in a wonderful house in Llewellyn Park. It had 17 bedrooms and fantastic gardens. And I think my love of gardens, I know my love of gardens started with Granny Franks walking me through the gardens and telling me the names of flowers. Now this is a tulip, or this is a hyacinth, or this is a daffodil. I don't care to garden myself, but I love gardens. I like arranging flowers, and I know my love of beautiful gardens came from Granny Franks. I grew up, I'm telling you about where I grew up, in Llewellyn Park in West Orange, New Jersey, which was about a half an hour out of New York City. And Llewellyn Park was a gated community. And 3 or 4 years ago, I went to the 150th anniversary of Llewellyn Park. There were perhaps 100 homes in Llewellyn Park, and everybody knew each other. Granny and Grandpa Franks lived there, so when Dad and Mother got married, Mother and Dad lived there. Thomas Edison lived across the fields from Granny and Grandpa Franks. And the Edisons had 3 sons, and Granny and Grandpa Franks had 3 sons. So the Edison boys and the Franks boys grew up together and played together. Also living in Llewellyn Park, across the street from where I grew up, were Mr. and Mrs. Colgate of Colgate toothpaste. And they had a tennis court, so I learned to play tennis. Granny and Grandpa had a tennis court too, so I learned how to play tennis on the Colgates and on Granny Franks' tennis court. Chubb Insurance, so I grew up with the grandchildren of, the Chubbs. And Merck Pharmaceuticals. So, I mean, those were the sorts of people who lived in Llewellyn Park. One day, my mother took my older sister. Well, I have an older sister, Barb, 4 years older, and an older brother, Jerry, who was 8 years older. And one day, Barb wanted to go into New York, so Mother drove Barb to the station in Orange, New Jersey, so Barb could take the train to Hoboken and get into New York. While we're doing this, the train comes out from Hoboken, and a lady gets off the train. And my mother said to me, I'm 10 years old in this memory, "Who does that lady look like to you?" And I said, "Well, she looks like our laundress." And Mother burst out laughing and said, "That is Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the President of the United States." Well, another thing about Llewellyn Park, everybody knew everybody. It was like a big club. Everyone who lived in the park knew everybody else. And my mother knew that Mrs. Roosevelt was a friend of a woman who lived in Llewellyn Park called Mrs. Parrish. And my mother was not particularly assertive, but she went up to Mrs. Roosevelt and introduced herself and said, "I'm Gertrude Franks, and I live in Llewellyn Park, and there's gas rationing, and I'm driving, my daughter and I are going back to the park now, and I was thinking, were you to be going to have lunch with Mrs. Parrish, could I offer you a ride?" And Mrs. Roosevelt, "Fine, perfectly fine." Mother said to me, "Get in the back seat." I pop in the back seat, and Mrs. Roosevelt gets in the front seat. And I mean, Mother and I didn't think that much about it. I mean, she had a very interesting conversation with Mrs. Roosevelt. And even though I was 10, when Mrs. Roosevelt kept talking about Winnie, I knew she was talking about Winston Churchill. Even though you didn't have a television, you knew who Winston Churchill was. So, I mean, can you imagine Michelle Obama getting off a train alone and being given a ride by a complete stranger? I mean, it just shows you what a different world I grew up in. Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, and my father had been a captain in the cavalry in the First World War and had gone to war in France, had slept in trenches. He never ever talked about it. I never knew anything about my father's life in the war. But every Sunday we had lunch with Granny and Grandpa, and that particular Sunday we came home to our house and we always turned on the radio and listened to the Philharmonic Symphony Concert. I'm reading a book, Ferdinand the Bull, a coloring book, and we're all in the living room, and they interrupt this symphony concert to say the Japanese have attacked the American base in Pearl Harbor. And I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was at the time, but what I will never forget was the look on my father's face, and he turned absolutely ashen white. I just knew this meant an awful lot to him. I didn't understand what quite it meant to him, but what it meant to him is the United States obviously was going to go into another world war. And it just must have brought back for him all the memories he had when he was serving our country in the First World War. I have never, ever forgotten. And every time I hear about Pearl Harbor, I see in my mind where he was sitting, where I was sitting, hearing on the radio the announcement of Pearl Harbor. Even though I was only 10, it was just a huge, huge event because it meant so much to him. Leather was rationed. Rubber was rationed. Because rubber was rationed, you couldn't get a new bicycle because you couldn't get new bike tires. And instead of buying any pair of shoes you wanted anytime you wanted a new pair of shoes, you were very careful of your shoes because leather was rationed because they needed the leather to make the shoes for the people in the army. in the Second World War. So I remember getting a pair of new shoes was a very, very big deal. Well, we always had help. We had a cook and a waitress and a perfectly wonderful governess named Mame. And Mame lived with our family for 18 years, and she didn't leave our house until I was 10 years old. So, as opposed today where you have a McDonald's, a fast food wasn't even in the lexicon when I grew up. You ate every single meal with your family. It was very, very, very rare to eat at a restaurant. I can't even remember. I mean, Mother was a member of the Colony Club, so if you went into New York City, you could eat at the Colony Club, but I don't even remember going out to eat at a restaurant. And the cook prepared the meals, and the waitress served the meals. And I remember once we had a brand new waitress who was from Poland, and she'd been in the war in some way. And my sister and I had milk. Everyone else had a glass of water at the table, but I had milk. And I drank half a glass of milk. And the waitress came by and poured half my glass of milk and filled it up with water. Well, I burst out laughing, and Mother got really mad because she thought it was so rude to the waitress. I thought it was really funny. I mean, am I going to drink half milk and half water? Not really, but, you know, it was just a different world. And we had a laundress. So that's why I thought Mrs. Roosevelt looked like a laundress. So I did learn how to cook. Never have learned how to do laundry. 7, I ate in the kitchen with the help until I was 7, until my table manners were sufficient for me to be at the dinner table. The holidays, we always celebrated in our house in the morning, and then we'd go to Granny and Grandpa Franks's for lunch. And then in the afternoon, we would go to Staten Island, where my mother's oldest sister, Aunt Eleanor, hosted the entire Walker family for Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holiday it was. That's when I'd see my other grandmother. And because of those events, I was very, very close to my Walker cousins. And I have many, many Walker cousins, and I'm still in very, very close touch and still see them. Last year I went east to a Smith reunion, and I saw a lot of my Walker cousins when I was east. And I love when the cousins know each other as children, because then they maintain that throughout their lives, and I'm very close to my cousins. Much, much closer to my Walker cousins than my Franks cousins. My father had 2 brothers, one lived in Philadelphia and one lived in California, and I just never saw those cousins quite as often. I started at Miss Baird's school in 1st grade, and I was 5 years old. And I walked into class the first day and said to Miss Johnson said to Joni Hanford, "Would you please show Marjorie where the crayons are?" And Joni Hanford said, "I don't want to." Joni Hanford was my closest friend at age 5 all the way through Baird School, and we still communicate. She got over not showing me the crayons. My first 2 years, I was not that strong a student. If you were under a certain level, I don't know what the number is or what the grade was, you were on something called the registrar's list. That was not a very good list. Was I on the registrar's list? Yes. And I honestly can't tell you what came to mind and why I decided I wasn't going to stay on the registrar's list. And in my last 2 years at Smith, by then you're picking courses that you're much more interested in taking. You're not taking the courses that the college makes you take. I ended up on the dean's list, and the dean's list means you have an average of B+ or more. So I graduated from the dean's list. I did select a major, and I selected a major of English literature for one reason. There was a very famous author, and she was a teacher, Mary Ellen Chase. And she wrote a book on the King James Version of the Bible that I had read and thought was fascinating. And I chose to major in English literature so I could take courses from Mary Ellen Chase. I thought she was just wonderful. I've always loved to read, and I always enjoy writing, and so English Lit was what I chose to do. And I continued on with athletics. I played field hockey, lacrosse. I played tennis for Smith. I went around New England playing tennis for Smith. The religion that my family, the Walker side of the family, for many, many generations was Church of England. So of course that's Episcopalian. And the Franks were Episcopalians. So I went to a church in West Orange called the Holy Innocents Church. And I was confirmed at 11. And I never doubted being an Episcopalian. And I continue being an Episcopalian today. My religion means a lot to me. And I've attended church here in Minnesota, St. Martin's by the Lake Episcopal Church, where certain members of our family still go, and they're having the 125th anniversary of that. That church was built by a man for his daughter's wedding. In 1988, my granddaughter, Leslie Hensel, was the flower girl in that wedding. And this year they're having the 125th anniversary, and they're doing, again, a reenactment of the wedding. And your daughter, Heidi, is going to be the bride, and Devon's daughter, Ainsley, is going to be the flower girl. And I think it's very special. 5 and 4 generations of the Hensel family have worshiped at St. Martin's. And I think in Minnesota that's a pretty good record. The reason this is so important is the very first flower girl in that original wedding in 1888 was my husband Carl's mother. Ray Goodnow was the very first flower girl. So that's why it's important that the Hensels maintain this tradition. So that's a lot of fun. We had a pet, a Cocker Spaniel, a sort of a reddish-haired Cocker Spaniel named Topper. And I was very, very fond of Topper. I loved Topper. You're asking, what did I do? I think it's terribly funny. In a conversation with my youngest granddaughter, Lucy, not that long ago, somehow the subject came up that Mother and Dad got their very first television set when I was 21, and they got it to see Queen Elizabeth's coronation. And I told this story to Lucy, and she looked at me and she said, well, what did you do growing up? Which is so typical. I mean, a Lucy Kearney, who's never not had a television all of her entire 15 years, does not understand how I could have lived for 21 years with a radio, a Victrola, books, the outdoors. I mean, it just made me laugh. Dad's family, his father was the only one who came to the United States, so he had brothers and sisters. Grandpa Franks had brothers and sisters, so Dad went to visit his aunts and uncles. So at age 6 was my first trip, and we took a boat called the Mauritania, and we took a boat to England. I have several memories of that trip, but one of the memories is I was introduced to salmon. And according to my mother, I ate salmon every meal on the boat.